Are we live? Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well and safe. I'm Janaína Carvalho, professor at Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. And this video is part of the event Abralinha ao Vivo, an initiative of Abralinha, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in cooperation with many international associations, include Permanent International Committee of Linguistics, Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, Sociedade da Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, a Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Societas Linguística Europeia, Australian Linguistic Society, the International Association of Applied Linguistics, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. And with great pleasure, I'll be the chair of Professor Theresa Biberauer's conference. Theresa Biberauer is a researcher at the University of Cambridge, who also holds extraordinary professorships at Stellenbosch University and the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Her interests lie in the theoretical and comparative syntax, both synchronic and diachronic, language acquisition, and language contact, with Germanic language and Afrikaans being areas of particular interest. And she has published extensively on these subjects. Among her many publications, I highlight The Limits of Syntactic Variation, a book she edited, Parametric Variation, Null Subjects in Minimalist Theory, co-authored with Anders Holmberg, Ian Roberts, and Michelle Sheehan, and more recently, The Final over Final Condition, published in 2017, and co-authored with Michelle Sheehan, Ian Roberts, and Anders Holmberg. Her current research is concerned with probing the extent to which it's possible, in the light of the past roughly 60 years of typological and generative research, to formulate an explicit, acquisitionally credible theory of how and why human languages take the form they do. Her talk today is entitled Emergent Variation from a Minimalist Perspective on the Significance of Imperatives. I want to thank Professor Biberauer on behalf of Abralinha for having accepted our invitation. And the screen is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Janaya. And before I'm going to share a PowerPoint, but just first, I do just want to say a huge congratulations, because I know this talk is happening at the end of what has been just weeks of absolutely phenomenal talks, which I know must have taken a huge amount of organization and which is of benefit to so many people. I think at this time, you and Abralin, you've really given us a fantastic example of how when things get tough, some absolutely fantastic ideas come up, and this is definitely one of them. So I'm extremely proud to be part of this initiative. Right, now, having said that, let me see if I can share my screen properly. Let's just see. Share. Oops, no. Is that all visible? Can you see? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so you've had my title and you've had my affiliations and my interests. In fact, a lot of what Janina spoke about just now will be coming up in my talk. So just to start, since as you saw there's, well, there are two words in my title where you may think emergent and minimalist. So let's start with some sort of traditional perspectives in linguistics, where you might think, well, generative, we'd certainly have on one side of a discussion, and then you'd want to contrast generativists with people who adopt a general cognitive or maybe a usage-based or constructivist position. And it's a traditional idea that these are two quite distinct camps. And also, as you can see from the color coding, generativists are typically very strongly connected with innatism, innate ideas, and general cognitivist usage-based theorist constructivists with the idea of emergence. And of course, if one thinks in terms of the classic generative algorithm, so where you assume there is a universal grammar, UG, so the innate component, and that in combination with linguistic data or primary linguistic data, PLD, the input, is what gives you an adult grammar, then it's quite clear that innatism, especially since at this stage the assumption was that this universal grammar would be a rich universal grammar containing a lot of information that is useful in constructing adult grammar, then it certainly seems like it makes sense to actually be distinguishing generativists very, very systematically from others, and that an innatist wouldn't be talking too much about emergentism because so much is coming from universal grammar. So that's very much a kind of two factors approach, which is the classic generative approach, which I know a lot of people still connect with generativism. But in reality, minimalism has actually changed that algorithm and adapted it quite a long time ago. So since the 1990s, in fact, the two-factor approach has actually been a three-factor approach. So in addition to the innate component and the linguistic input, there are now general cognitive factors, and there you see general cognitive, which are also part of this algorithm and assumed to play a role in creating the adult grammar. And very importantly, the universal grammar in this approach is assumed to be minimalist, very minimal, so very impoverished. And certainly the assumption is not that there would be contents of the sort that was classically assumed. So in the 1980s government and binding module, where, for example, in that approach, it was assumed that universal grammar would contain a vast specification, for example, of parameters. That is no longer assumed. And of course, we have to think about what are these general cognitive factors. So very importantly, Chomsky has actually specified two types of general cognitive factors that are relevant. The first he describes as principles of data analysis of the sort used in acquisition and other domains. So that's really sort of learning biases and so on, how one actually approaches this input. And then also principles of efficient computation, so that the representations that are actually postulated are such that the cognitive system can operate in an efficient way on them. So that's quite a different framework. And if one thinks about the three factors framework, then you really think that minimalist generative theory today is emphasizing two kinds of innate predisposition. So it's not just the UG that we had in the classic approach, but general cognitive principles as well. So, oops, right, yes. So there's then really a question whether in the minimalist era it is correct to make to create a dichotomy between generative and general cognitive. And then also we've said that the innate component these days is assumed to be very underspecified. And if one thinks, one can think about that in various ways. And I know there was an Abralin talk, which I did manage, a debate, which I did manage to listen to some of. Marcel den Dicken just a few days ago was confirming that he reckons with minimalism, we have very little in universal grammar. So it's very underspecified. But that view you can also find in relation to the specific categories, for example, that might be part of universal grammar. It's set out in detail in Martina Wilczko's work, in Ramchandran Swanonius, in many people's work. The assumption is that the content that universal grammar, the specific grammatical categories, for example, that universal grammar contributes to the acquisition algorithm is actually, it's very underspecified. So then again, there's a question, if there's far less that's innate, and we still want to say that there is a grammar, the kind of systematic grammar that we as generativists have always assumed adults end up with, then a lot more of that can't be innate, the specifics, it must be emergent. So that dichotomy is not obvious either. And it's very interesting if we look outside of linguistics. Emergence, of course, is not actually a notion which is just, it's not linguistic specific. So there's a book which I found very inspiring by he's a pioneer in the study of complex adaptive systems and also known as the father of genetic algorithms, John H. Holland. His book on emergence, basically, Tony Curzon Price came up with a very useful characterization of what he says about what emergence actually is. If you think of complex adaptive systems more generally, it basically, we talk about emergence when one of the types that constitutes whatever reality you're looking at is shown to be the product of other interacting types. that's when you can talk about one type. The first type has emerged from the others. So there's really a sense of thinking about the foundations of the system and the way the whole and the parts interrelate. So that's the book I was just referring to. Of course, it's a very ancient idea. So Aristotle was already debating with Plato that the whole needs to be thought of as something besides just the parts. And then I can give you a familiar refrain in generative linguistics. We're always hearing about Humboldt and his talk about language being a system which makes infinite use of finite means. Again, if you're using finite means, there you will have only so many parts and they need to relate in a way. The way they relate will allow you to create wholes, which clearly have to be something more than just the parts. And very interestingly, actually, there's an aspect of Humboldt's work which I think is undercited and is very important in the context of this whole emergence discussion. And that is his statement, so that actually the system is a system which makes infinite use of finite means, and the synthesis of those finite means creates something that is not present per se in any of the associated constituents. So we shouldn't just be thinking what are the units and how we make use of them, but also we should be expecting that some of what we get out of that system, the whole, is not going to be as straightforward as just saying these are the parts. And those are emergent properties, which Abler, in an article, also a very interesting article from 1989, he ascribes to Humboldt systems generally. So that's not just language. Abler actually wrote about language, he talked about chemistry, and he also talked about genetics. So in general, emergent properties should have that property that they are infinite use of finite means, but the synthesis must create something which isn't present per se in any of the associated constituents. So my objective in this talk is then going to be to consider and think a little bit about what emergent variation might look like if we're looking at language from the perspective of a 3 factors minimalist model. Right, so just so that you know roughly what the structure of the talk is going to be, the first part, I'm just going to introduce the 3 factors minimalist model that I want to be talking about. So this is a model which I've been working on for nearly a decade now, the Maximise Minimal Means model, or MMM. And I'm going to set out a little bit how emergent variation works in the context of that model. And then the second part, this is where the imperatives in the title of my talk come into play. I'm going to be talking about imperative structures and their importance in fixing emergent variation. And here my focus empirically is going to be on some Southern African case studies. You heard I'm also connected to 2 South African universities, and my great interest is in languages spoken in Southern Africa. So that's where the empirical focus is going to be. Right, so let's start with part 1 and think about this Maximise Minimal Means model. So remember the current minimalist model, we have 3 factors now. And the additional factor, Chomsky did give a characterization of what the additional factor is, and we know they're general cognitive factors, but there's quite a range of discussion. Well, sometimes no discussion at all, but sometimes quite a range of discussion as to what sort of third factors are relevant. What the Maximise Minimal Means model suggests is not that MMM is it, but just that Maximise Minimal Means is a key general cognitive factor that shapes adult grammars. And the thinking about Maximise Minimal Means is that this should be thought about as a general cognitive bias. So it's definitely something that will come into play as a learning bias in shaping acquisition. But of course, it's meant to be general cognitive. So we should be seeing evidence for the action of Maximise Minimal Means outside of language and language acquisition as well. And here I think the evidence is quite strong. So there are a range of things I've mentioned there. I won't go through all of them in detail, but those of you who've read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, that the thinking fast on the sort of the idea of fast and frugal heuristics fits in with Maximise Minimal Means, where you're actually in making judgments and decisions, you're using a limited amount of information, consciously simple building blocks in order to minimize the amount of computation that is required to come to that decision. That's maximizing minimal means in that particular domain. But it's also, if you look at many theories of concept formation, and this is actually, it's very interesting, a range of literature has come up with strikingly very similar ideas, that if one is trying to make sense of a domain, the way in which it is divided up so that one ends up with concepts, there's a sort of successive division logic which often holds. So that again looks like maximizing minimal means. If you're just you make one division and then you make another division rather than randomly dividing up a conceptual domain. Pattern coding, that's from vision, that's actually very interesting as well. I won't go into that in great detail, except that it's very interesting that vision, actually, lots of people think that's about actually the amount of absolute light, but actually it's very much about contrast and the way the visual receptors work. We have cells which differentiate themselves into on-center cells and off-center cells, and they become inhibited or excited depending on if an on-center cell, if it is stimulated in the center, then it becomes active, and if there's stimulation in the periphery, then it is inhibited. And there's off-center cells work the opposite way. And very interestingly, neighboring cells also affect each other. And basically, what the bottom line is, it basically means that with vision, what is coded is contrast. And perception is really very biased towards edges. So being able to define the edges of domains. And that's something that's going to come up in the linguistic part of this talk as well. And the last thing is just something very different, something that humans actually create. But there you see again, if there is a cognitive bias, there's no reason why the actual artifacts that humans come up with shouldn't also be reflecting maximize minimal means. And in human writing systems, it's been observed in part by Stanislas Dehaene that if one looks at writing systems, the majority of characters actually seem to be made of 3 strokes or less, which is very interesting. And then Olivier Morin also highlights the fact that the cardinal orientations, so horizontal and vertical, are vastly overrepresented in the world's languages if you compare them to the oblique ones, which of course picks up on our orientational bias. We can just tell those apart more straightforwardly. And I could carry on. The point is it seems to be that in a range of domains where general cognition is relevant, some sort of the spirit of maximize minimal means seems to be in play. Well, we're thinking about language, so can we see maximize minimal means in language? Well, there seems to be plenty of evidence too. So if we just look on the slide, I again won't go through everything, but within just syntax, if you maximize minimal means, clearly if you can recycle something and use it again, that's making the most of something that you have. So that's really, in a way, what grammaticalization is. One, for example, takes a lexical item like possessive have, and it gets recycled and becomes a perfect marker, for example. These famous changes, or go becoming a future, etc., etc. But one also sees it at the level of features. So if you think of case, for example, as a feature, we usually think it has something to do with maybe grammatical relations. But in many systems, and for example, Korean and Japanese are both examples, case is actually also used to help code discourse relations. So topicality, for example, if one drops accusative case in Japanese, or if one doubles, I think it's nominative case in Korean, I think if I'm not mistaken, there's actually a focus interpretation and so on. And there are many of these sorts of features which have many different purposes within the grammar when one starts looking more carefully. The last one I will come up again, so I'll just mention it briefly. Coincide. This is a feature originally due to Hale, which Martina Wilschko has made a lot of use of in her work, and Daniel Harbour as well. So coincide, very general, semantically broad, ontologically very flexible kind of feature, which is just a feature which, if something coincides, for example, temporally, that's now. If it doesn't coincide, it would be not now. You can apply that to many, many domains. We'll see that coming up as well. And then there's also extended use of categories that seem to be acquired early on. So, for example, we don't just have nouns and verbs, and I'm not suggesting that they're simple, but we certainly see that basic nouniness, you have nominalization phenomena, meaning basic nouniness is applied more generally. Or, for example, verbs. Very often verbs are used as reference points. So, for example, in focus systems, you get immediately before the verb, so the verb is the reference point. What is before the verb counts as focused, or the opposite, after the verb is focused. phenomena like featural relativized minimality as well, it wouldn't be possible if we didn't see if features weren't limited in terms of the kinds of features they were. It's not clear that you would actually be able to propose a featural relativized minimality, because it actually relies on you being able to calculate. There must be sufficiently similar features which either are too similar or they allow an operation to take place. So again, you have a restriction on, you need a restriction on the features in the system for that actually to work. Structure building I won't talk about specifically, but the penthouse principle is a very clear one. So Ross's idea that, in his terms, there's always more going on upstairs than downstairs. So main clauses have a wider range of syntactic phenomena than embedded clauses. And of course, if that's true, that makes, as David Lightfoot has pointed out, could potentially make learning more straightforward, because you don't need to pay attention separately to embedded clauses. And there are various other things. In language acquisition, more generally, there's of course a lot of discussion of how less is more and how one should start small. So again, that sounds a lot like Maximise Minimal Means. So, right, there seems to be then general cognitive evidence for this idea, and then also within the syntax and in language acquisition. Now, the idea with this model is that Maximise Minimal Means is a third factor which interacts with, remember, it's a very impoverished universal grammar. So this universal grammar, I'm going to follow lots of people. It's, again, quite similar to what Marcel van Dicken was talking about during his contribution to the series. So I'm going to assume the operations merge and agree, and then also crucially a formal feature template, right? And so not a full inventory of features from which there needs to be a selection, but just a template which says in structuring grammars, we are going to be doing this in terms of formal features. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to build on the featural distinction that Chomsky made in his 95 book, where he said, well, we can distinguish grammatical or formal features from phonological and semantic features. So the idea then is that universal grammar does contribute. So it's really important universal grammar is doing something. It's contributing in the acquirer what we might think of as a formal feature, the F expectation, so in respect of grammatical variation. So the idea will be that anything that is a grammatical property or grammatical regularity needs to be coded in terms of formal features and not via a vast range of different sort of formal devices, formal features. So it's a version, I guess, of the Bourrier-Chomsky type of idea. Right, so if we just think about the input that an acquirer gets in the terms of Chomsky 1995, you might then say that the mappings between sound and meaning, so that's the phonological features and the semantic features, that's just Saussurian arbitrariness. So words, that is captured just by mapping between sounds and P and S features. But the grammatically regulated sound meaning mappings, so where you basically have grammatical regularities, this is where you have phonological and semantic features in play, but crucially also formal features, right? And in what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to make a distinction between the Saussurian arbitrariness, which is just the famous completely arbitrary lexical variation that we see, and systematic departures from Saussurian arbitrariness, which these are the grammatical regularities. So the idea then is that there are actually degrees of arbitrariness in human language. Right, and then what does Maximise Minimal Means do? Well, so we have the UG saying that grammatical variation needs to be captured in terms of formal features. What MMM does is drive acquirers to postulate these formal features sparingly, right? So one manifestation of Maximise Minimal Means is feature economy, postulate as few features as possible. And then when you've got a feature, the other side of that is to generalize it and recycle the feature as much as possible. So that's feature generalization. So what's very important here then is on this model, acquisition isn't just about conservative acquirers, right? So I know that's discussed quite often in the literature that acquirers in a generative model need to be conservative, but the MMM acquirer is conservative in postulating new features, right? So the idea is that features will only be postulated if there's some sort of grammatical regularity. So if there's a contrast that needs to be captured. And that's the one circumstance. And then the idea would be that instead of postulating a new feature, you try to capture the regularity on the basis of features already in the system. And so the only point where you would postulate a new feature is where you cannot recycle an existing feature where it's clear something new is needed. So that is quite conservative. But the acquirer is then liberal about extending the existing formal features to new domains. And sometimes that's correct. That's what you're meant to do in order to figure out how the grammar works. But sometimes it could also be, there could be a mistake, that the child has actually made an incorrect generalization about the feature, and then that can lead to change. And that is also what you assume might happen where the input is ambiguous or maybe unsystematic, because we know that children can regularize unsystematic input. So these are basically going beyond the input scenarios. Right, and what MMM does as well is to drive acquirers to be what I've been calling Goldilocks acquirers for a while now. And this builds on ideas which definitely don't come from the Chomskyan tradition at all. So Kidd, Piantadosi, and Aslan have done research on vision and on audition, where they have proposed this Goldilocks type of approach, where again, the idea is that as in vision and audition, where the proposal is that the child is just making the most of the input that is accessible, or in the Goldilocks kind of story, it's just right at every stage of the acquisition. The idea is that that's exactly what is also going on with acquisition. So the idea then is that when children are acquiring their language, thinking about how they manage to do this, and sort of looking at the adult grammar and saying, my goodness, that's so complicated, how do the children manage this, is not the right way to look at it. Instead, on this kind of Goldilocks, MMM-driven Goldilocks view, what you would expect is that children are not actually trying to take in all the input. In fact, the intake is just a subset, and that's just what happens to be accessible to them. And at the earlier stages, there's a lot of discussion in literature, there's a lot of literature on this, that at the earlier stages, prosody is clearly something that children have access to from very early on, and that may actually help them to identify a lot of prosodic phrases, for example, and again, the edges of prosodic phrases, that they can already identify these before the point where they're actually starting to learn actual lexical items. And yeah, so that prosody might be a starting point where you don't have to map between sound and meaning specifically. But then there also seems to be some really nice evidence for the importance of the sort of semantic and other phonological features that children acquire early on. And I refer here to a dissertation, PhD dissertation from last year by Peter Msaka from the University of Stellenbosch, who was looking at the acquisition of the Chichewa nominal system, where the noun classes, very complicated, but early acquired semantic and phonological features seem to be crucial there. But now with the lexical stages in general, we just need a better understanding of which aspects of the input actually constitute the intake. So what is actually accessible to the child? And this point has been made a lot. And of course, the challenge is to try to work out, so what is the intake? And I'm not going to give a solution to this, but the idea is, in the context of the MMM model, it's quite clear that we shouldn't be thinking about that second factor, the input component of the algorithm. We shouldn't be thinking that what we're looking at is everything that the child hears. The real question is, what is accessible to the child, and how does that help the child to develop its system? Right, and then just in terms of a general characterization of what is the input, so remember, not all of this is equally accessible at all stages to the child. Well, we talked, remember, about the degrees of arbitrariness. So clearly, some of the input are lexical sound meaning mappings, so involving just the phonological and semantic features, and some of it are grammatically regulated sound meaning mappings. So this is where the formal features come into play as well. And the second type of arbitrariness is then what centers on what I've been calling systematic departures from Saussurean arbitrariness. And some examples of systematic departures from Saussurean arbitrariness is, if you think of Saussurean arbitrariness in the most straightforward sense, is just that there should be a one-to-one form meaning mapping, which is completely arbitrary. But in cases, for example, where you find more form than meaning, so for example, you might think about some forms of agreement or concord or other types of doubling phenomena, that would be an example of a systematic departure. Also the opposite, where you find a meaning, but there doesn't seem to be an overt form. So various forms of what you might call systematic silence, some of which are more readily accessible to the child. So null arguments are acquired early, and they contrast with overtly realized arguments, of course, so that may make it simpler, but others are not going to be acquired very early on. One form with too much meaning, this is basically what Martina Wilschke refers to as multifunctionality. So where you have a given form which seems to occur in various different positions in the structure and have different meanings depending on where it occurs. So that type of phenomenon is another systematic departure from just learning random form meaning sort of pairings where there's no formal feature involved. And then, of course, a very fundamental thing that is very important from early on, the high frequency forms that we think of as we talk about as functional items, functional categories, which typically have a very fixed edge position. So if you think of where determiners or auxiliaries and those sorts of elements actually occur, it's at the edge of phrases. So of course, they're very useful elements to help the child to delimit the categories that they're working with. The big question then is, okay, so we've seen prosody, or I've said that it's been discussed greatly in the literature that prosody seems to be a nice minimal means, a nice way in for child acquirers when they're trying to sort of make the first steps in figuring out the grammar of their language. But how can we actually make progress in establishing which departures from Saussurean arbitrariness are just right for acquirers at different stages of acquisition, particularly the earlier ones, where, of course, they're going to be postulating features which they want to recycle. So now we move to the second part, where I want to talk a little bit about the significance of imperative structures. And yeah, I do just want to say again, I'm not trying to suggest that imperative structures are in any way a solution to how children sort of identify the relevant the input. I'm not trying to suggest that the imperative structures are the input that are key, but you'll see how I actually what I'm trying to do. I mean, I don't think we can answer that question of what's the right, what are the sort of successive types of input that are accessible to the child. We can't, that question is much too hard at this point, but I think it is worth thinking about structures that may do an important job in signaling the contrasts that are so sort of central to building up the formal feature system that seems to constitute the grammar. So what I want to suggest is that imperative structures are important structures, right? So let's see why. Right, so this is just, there's a more general sort of idea that we might be used as generativists used to thinking about declaratives in particular as structures that children learn a lot from. But since 2015, I've been thinking a lot about looking comparatively at the structures in different languages that are used to express questions and commands. And the idea is that these are actually really important in helping to structure core aspects of the grammar and also some more peripheral ones, which I'll talk about in more detail. I'm just going to focus on imperatives today. So let's think about some initial reasons why imperatives you might think, okay, they could potentially be quite important as a basis for signaling foundational syntax, or maybe reinforcing it, because it could, of course, be that it's present in other structures too, for example, declaratives, but that it becomes particularly clear when you're looking at imperatives. So first of all, in many languages, imperatives exhibit a rich and strongly contrastive syntax. So in terms of the ways in which imperatives are structured, some languages make use of true imperatives, both the positive and the negative, but we also know, and you will know as speakers of Portuguese, that there are languages where a positive imperative and a negative imperative have very different syntax, which of course is very useful to the child. And even languages which make use of prohibitives, well, English effectively does as well, and we will see Afrikaans. Also the imperatives convey an awful lot of information, which is strongly contrastive and very useful. I'll elaborate on this so you'll see exactly what I mean. So also the imperatives, of course, are, well, in many societies, and certainly in my own experience in relation to my child, for example, find that imperatives are very frequent in the input. And of course, in the societies where that's not the case, that the way language acquisition proceeds there is a very valuable control scenario. And then also very useful about imperatives is that you can, to at least some extent, establish whether the imperative was actually understood by looking at the child's response. So these are all quite useful things. I just want to mention, since of course I'm aware that in the literature there's a discussion about the extent to which children, young children, are actually producing imperatives at various stages compared to the amount of imperative input they get. And it's been observed that for different languages, children both under and overproduce imperative forms. And that's really not what I'm concerned with, because in all cases, what one can see is in the imperatives that the children are producing, one sees that certain properties are correct from early on, which is very interesting. And what we, of course, can still see, regardless of how many imperatives that children produce, you can still see to what extent they've understood what they were about. So yes, and then I just wanted to mention, since today is exactly a month and a day since we lost our colleague Janne Bondi Johannesson, she also had this idea that imperatives could potentially be really, really significant in the context of acquisition. And this is actually a really nice paper that I just wanted to point to. But all right, let's go back to that the sort of unspoken traditional Chomskyan view that declarative sentences are kind of a point of departure for child acquirers. Oops. So the idea, it's explicitly stated in quite a few models that if you think about the clause structure, syntactic clause structure, that in a way you can think of it as being built from the bottom up. So Radford's small clause approach explicitly has that idea. Rizzi's truncation hypothesis also fits in with that. And we've got various models that work like that. So the idea would be that if you think of a clause which has the lexical verb at the bottom, that you would start, the child would start learning producing structures which only include that component of the structure, and then gradually add higher levels, so the aspectual level, which there is evidence that the here and now related properties are relatively early, and then the temporal one should come next. And then if your language does temporal anchoring, of course, not all of them do, and the discourse one should be last. But there's actually considerable evidence that if you think of C as being the head connected with discoursey things, that at least in part, aspects of C are acquired before T in well-studied languages. So if we just look at English, for example, these English T elements, we have lots of evidence in numerous databases. And unfortunately, with the first example that I have here with the data from Nina, Peter, and Naomi, I didn't manage to actually check the precise ages. So it's file 7, file 10, and file 56. But the ages are similar to what we have here for Adam. The important point is what you can see in that data in 8 is that we have WH movement, right? Where the other one, where boat, you have that, but you have no sign of any T element. And we also have children at a similar sort of age. So we have Adam's examples where you can see quite clearly there's an alternation between use and non-use of what we would call a T element. Copulars in English, of course, move to T. So it seems that you've got WH movement, something which requires you to have a C in the structure. But what's going on with T isn't so clear. It's not so clear that T is present yet. So there's evidence of auxiliary trouble, but some form of C is already in place. And if we look a little bit more, you can see that auxiliaries, at least in English, so these are canonical T elements, they really seem to create quite an acquisitional challenge. So we've got examples from Radford where at least one child assumed that was actually quite a useful question focus force marker. So you can see that in 9a, and something similar with R in 10. And then you can see in 11 the whole idea that tense, the auxiliaries are connected with tense and that they are the specialized tense elements. That's not clear at all if you see these double marking examples like did we ate and what did you bought and so on. So clearly there's quite a lot of T trouble. And here we see it again, the WH movement, quite unproblematic, but a range of possibilities as far as the auxiliary is concerned. So this suggests that there's unclarity as to what's going on with T at a point where WH movement is already very consistent. So it may actually be that what we should be thinking is that a child clearly learns things going down, what's going on in the lexical domain, at least some aspects of that. But that maybe once that's in place, the next thing is not to keep going up the tree, but that maybe C would be something that gets fleshed out quite early on. And in English, at least, and it's very important that languages definitely vary. So not all languages connect are so strongly have a C which is so specifically connected with things like questioning and so on. But in English, at least, it looks like polarity. The C, early specification for C, seems to be something polarity related. And if we use something like Anders Holmberg's feature system, he thinks about affirmation having positive polarity. Of course, everybody says that. Negation, that is a negative polarity. And he talks about interrogativity as being an open polarity. So if one thinks in featural terms, one could say, well, that is the attribute which is not yet specified. And then that's a wonderful attribute, a feature to learn early, because then you can recycle it and you can use it and flesh it out by giving it, you can have an unspecified value, but it can equally have a positive value, which means, or a coinciding, remember that multiply usable feature, a positive value or a negative value. So yeah, that's it could be that that's what's going on. But the point is that would be English C being specified in some way before T is filled out. And if you think about the English T, we often say that the auxiliaries in English are tense elements, but actually if they were, we would be expecting the use of do in neutral declaratives, which is not what we see. And actually the thinking of polarity as a core specification on English T, so recycling that, maybe acquiring it via C and then recycling it onto T, is not a crazy idea for English. So basically the bottom line, the important point is really just the bottom-up approach to functional category acquisition may well be mistaken. And actually there's a potentially appealing minimalist hypothesis that one could propose if one thinks about the logic of how grammatical categories are acquired, if you think from a minimalist kind of perspective. And that would be to appeal to Chomsky's 2000, the duality of semantics idea, and say that that is key from the start. So in terms of duality of semantics, we want to distinguish in human language between the expression of thematic information, so predicate argument structure, and scope discourse information. So for example, interrogative, imperative, topic, and focus, and so on. And one might say that with acquisition, maybe what the child is doing is first of all some basic predicate argument acquisition, which is basically what everybody says, that it's something, everybody says something along those lines, that children learn about objects and properties of objects, and then add animacy and various kinds of things. So that kind of thing is a sensible starting point. But then maybe you would expect that the second type of semantics also gets into play early. And that second type of semantics is precisely discourse related. So that would mean that you wouldn't go from V to T to C, but that you might go directly to C. So right, the rest of this talk, this was just the sort of background section. The rest of the talk now, what we're going to do is consider some case studies which actually suggest that the grammar which is signaled in imperatives, so a discourse marked structure, is very significant in acquisition, where I'm thinking about acquisition as the fixing of emergent properties. And I said my case studies were going to come from South Africa. That's also because I think contact languages are particularly interesting. And I should just clarify from the start, in my mind, all languages are contact languages in a certain sense, because it's not really, I mean, we're all exposed to multiple types of input, even if we think of ourselves as monolingual. But there are clearly cases where there are languages that everybody would accept as being distinct in potentially quite significant ways, which are in contact. And there, I think these languages have a great potential to tell us as generativists things that we mightn't always be able to see as clearly if we look at languages which are less radically contact languages. So, right, we're going to move on to the case studies part of thinking about the imperative structures. And what we're going to do now, if you're in Brazil, I'm going to stay in the Southern Hemisphere, but cross the Atlantic, and we're going to look at Southern Africa. And in particular, what we're going to do is look at South Africa, so the green country, and then Namibia, which is the salmon pinky one, at least on my screen. And we're going to look at Afrikaans. You did hear that I'm very interested in Afrikaans. Namibian German, and in a smaller font because South African English is going to come up much less. And the question is going to be, what sorts of things do basic imperatives tell us about the structural makeup of these languages, and particularly also about the core and some of the more peripheral components of their structure and what makes them similar and different from standard Dutch. So it's important that Afrikaans is very closely connected to Dutch. It sort of certainly has its roots in 17th century Dutch, but has been in contact with a great number of languages and is actually strikingly different from Dutch in many respects. And then Namibian German, you can tell, is a type of German, and South African English is a type of English. So I'm going to see what basic imperatives can tell us about these languages. Right. So the idea, the key idea here again, remember, is that the hypothesis really is that significant components of the early grammar are actually directly signaled or potentially reinforced. So you may see them in other types of structures, but they're signaled or reinforced by the potentially quite short, syntax-rich, and then crucially also intrinsically speaker-hearer-oriented marked structures that you find in questions and imperatives. And as you know, I'm just going to look at imperatives. So that means, of course, that as generativists who are interested in acquisition and sources of input that might be intake from an early stage, we should be looking carefully at the structure of imperatives and interrogatives in trying to understand the properties of adult grammars. And yeah, I've made the point already about context varieties. So let's start with Afrikaans. And this, yes, rather unusual first slide just features the Afrikaans language monument. This is a language which has its own monument. The monument is meant to reflect the influences that have come together to sort of shape the Afrikaans language. And I can tell you that there are various components to this, which, it's certainly not a linguist who designed this monument, as erected in 1975, but there are representations of the country. You can see in the monument that there are various components that come from different languages. So we've got certainly the contribution of Europe is A, and then Africa is B, that low wall, and then you've got F, Malay is a language. F is kind of a link as well, and then there are those funny little bumps which don't have a number. These are the Bantu languages. So the important point is that Afrikaans certainly is a language which has been influenced by a great diversity of languages. Now we're looking at its imperatives, and first of all at its positive imperatives. And so if you want to express a positive imperative in Afrikaans, you might say something like maak die deur toe. And what you can see immediately there also from the translation is that this is a structure which is verb initial, and it's also a structure which seems to be able to separate two components of a verb. So the verbal bit mark and a particle like bit to. And anybody who's studied German or has looked at Dutch will go, aha, yes. Or even if you might have looked at the history of earlier English, you see straight away this seems to be a structure where you have verb movement, because mark to mark is a single element, but in this structure, these two parts can be separated. And then we also see that you have die deur separates the two components, right? So the negative imperative is quite different. So in Afrikaans, you have to say moenie die deur toe maak nie. And here you can see that we were indeed correct in saying that toe maak is a sort of a unit which is separated in the positive imperative. We see here very clearly that the object precedes the verb, but of course you won't see that in every positive imperative, right? Because in the positive imperatives, you only see that when there's a particle. So if I were to change mark to a verb like shut, sluit, I would say sluit die deur. You wouldn't be able to tell what the position of the object is. So the positive imperative doesn't tell you that. The negative imperative does, which is important. And the other important thing about this negative imperative, of course, is that it is initiated with the prohibitive marker moenie. So moenie we'll talk about in quite a lot more detail. So let's first talk about the positive imperatives. So Afrikaans positive imperatives, we had maak die deur toe. And what I've done here is to show you that you can really see by using usual adverb tests, you see very clearly that the verb is moving to a high position. So maak gou die deur toe. You can't, as in English, you can't say make quickly the door closed. Write quickly the answer down. So this is a movement that is clearly into a higher domain. And what we also see if we look at the positive imperative, it's actually very similar to German which it's part of the same language family. So mach schnell die Tür zu, or very similar to Dutch as well, doe snel die deur dicht. So the positive imperative, you see very clearly if you look at the data that it's signaling that there is verb movement, verb fronting. But very importantly in Afrikaans, unlike in Dutch, right? In Dutch, but not German, interestingly. In Dutch parents can direct an infinitival imperative to their children if they want to tell them to do something. So as you can see in 4, it's possible to have an infinitive form where you can then see that an object needs to occur before a verb. You can't do that in Afrikaans though, right? So in Afrikaans, positive imperatives always signal verb movement to see. Then there are some other things that we also see in positive imperatives. So we can modulate them in various ways to try and be a bit more polite, or sometimes to express annoyance or various other things. And what we use here, this is quite important, what we actually use here are modal particles, which anybody who's tried to work on these will tell you that they're extremely difficult to pin down. Semantically, trying to figure out what's going on is very difficult, and formally, people haven't had the best ideas about what to do with them either. So what's very interesting, though, is that these are a very salient component of child-directed imperatives, and very strikingly, too, children use these from very, very early on, which is very interesting because, of course, they have a strong pragmatic connection. So if I say, maak toch die deur toe, as in 5a, that toch, adding the modal particle in, sort of changes the nature, gives you kind of changes the character of the exhortation, right? So it could be wheedling depending on my tone, or I could be expressing annoyance, etc., etc. And then I could use other modal particles, and then I modulate the basic shut the door instruction in other ways. So if I use the word for but, which is maar, then I'm saying, oh, all right, just close the door then, that's all right, it's a concession. And very interestingly, especially if you compare this to English, in the positive imperative, we also see that if you want to add please, in Afrikaans, there are 3 places where you can potentially do that. And sort of the most commonly used one is actually 5c, so maak asseblief die deur toe. You can also have it at the end of the sentence and at the start, just as you would for English. But as you can see with English, you can't say make please the door closed or shut please the door. That's a position that Afrikaans has that English doesn't. And here we see, remember with the negative imperative, you can modulate a negative imperative with these modal particles or with a please and asseblief as well. And in that case, it's very interesting because the moenie actually can split into 2 parts. Moet, toch, nie. And that's very interesting because it seems to have had a major, and we'll see this right at the end of the talk, but this possibility seems to have affected the way the must modal is actually interpreted. So because it can go with these downtoning particles, it's not interpreted necessarily as a very strong modal. Yeah. And then we also have modulated imperatives where you can add light verbs. So go, for example, or walk, or the combination of them. If you add that into an imperative that also conveys particular types of speaker-hero meaning. Again, it can depend on the context, whether you're expressing annoyance or whether you're trying to convince making somebody more likely to do what you're asking them to do. That just depends. The important thing is that these modal or discourse particles and light verbs are very frequent in speech, and particularly also when you're addressing children, and they tell us a lot. They're speaker-hero oriented elements. And sort of from a formal perspective, so that's just obviously pragmatics and discourse, but from a formal perspective, they're very interesting because what they seem to do is to signal that Afrikaans actually has a clause medial speaker-hero oriented domain, right? So if you think in English, we said your please can go at the beginning, at the end, but not really in the middle. In Afrikaans, it's perfectly fine to have them in that medial domain. And if one probes more carefully than I can on these slides, it really looks like those speaker-hero-oriented elements are at the little VP phase edge. So if you think in terms of phases, certainly at the edge of the lower phasal domain, the one that we usually think correlates with that first type of semantic meaning, the thematic meaning in Chomsky's duality. So really, just to give this a diagrammatic sort of illustration, we're all familiar with trees that have little VP dominated by TP dominated by CP, but if you adopt a phasal perspective, what it looks like is that languages may actually make use of phase edges generally to convey speaker-hearer related meaning. And that particles, so these are elements, of course, these particles that syntactically oriented people often sort of don't pay so much attention to, but it might actually be very useful for us to pay attention to if it turns out that they may mark the edges. Remember we said edges of domains are very important? Well, if these grammatically and semantically and discourseally quite complex elements, if what they're doing grammatically is marking edges of domains, and especially since we have so many of them in child input, again, this could be a useful signal for them to determine this is a particular type of syntactic domain. Right, so I will leave that here, and here is just an observation that these light verbs that are signaled crucially in the imperatives have led to a phenomenon in Afrikaans. Afrikaans has kept the verb second, so we already saw that verbs are raising high to the C position, which is typical of a verb second language. Afrikaans has retained this property, which is very interesting. I'll come to that in a second. But it's got a very strange type of verb second phenomenon, which Mark de Vos has called quirky verb second. And it crucially is a type of verb second which is very clearly signaled in imperatives. So I can, of course, use these quirky verb second structures. You see them in declarative. So I've given some examples in 8a and a question also in B. But that in Afrikaans, you can see that sort of quirky option definitely comes from imperatives. Some of you may be familiar with Gert-Jan Posma's work on Brazilian Pomeranian. And in that case, there's also a sort of quirky verb second, but that crucially you never see in imperatives. And it only involves, I think it's the perfect auxiliary and modal. So it's clearly a very different thing to what we have in Afrikaans. Right, so that's positive. Let's talk a little bit about negative imperatives, because there's actually a lot of really key stuff here. So remember that the negative imperative in Afrikaans requires you to have moenie, which is very different from Dutch, as you can see. Right, so in Dutch, there's the option of fronting a verb, basically just adding nie. So if you think of Dutch, the positive imperative would be doe de deur dicht. So that's in 9a, and you just add the niet before the particle, and then you get the negative. Or you can actually use that infinitival structure. In Afrikaans, you have to make use of moenie, right? So they're formed quite differently. Yeah, so I've already said that. So Dutch basically just takes the positive and adds a nicht, not a nicht, a niet. That's the German. The German does that. And Afrikaans forces you to use this moenie, right? And the source of the moenie seems to be a combination of Malay influence and then potentially also what happens in the regular acquisition of Dutch, because there seems to be a stage where you have a kind of modal negation related element in the first position. But now what's important here is, what does the child actually learn from the negative imperative? Well, firstly, my language is OV, right? Very clearly, because moenie has to be in first position. That means the verb in this case, although we know it does move, it doesn't move in a negative imperative because moenie is in that first position. That means that you get clear order, evidence for the OV nature of Afrikaans. The imperative also signals that we have high verb movement. So with moenie, and remember we saw that the child has evidence from the modulating particles that moenie is actually moet nie, so the connection to the modal moet is very strong. And then, of course, the child also sees my language is negative concord, because in Afrikaans you always have to combine moenie, whatever it is, and nie at the end. So two negative elements that make only one semantic negation. So in Afrikaans imperatives, there's actually a strong signal for two core West Germanic properties, OV, and that V to C, the high verb movement, plus one innovated one, because neither Dutch nor German nor any other West Germanic language has this negative concord. And this is all very clearly signaled in Afrikaans imperatives, and these are very stable properties in Afrikaans. Why is it interesting? Well, there are two main things that I want to highlight. One of them relates to the OV plus V to C, or if you like, that's the key component to V2. These are known to both be early acquired, right? But they're often, I'm never so sure now if it's really true that OV and V2 are really so susceptible to change. So maybe it's better to say they are thought to be susceptible to change. But certainly, if you look at a lot of discussions of the history of English, the suggestion has been that OV is an unstable property if there's a lot of interaction with languages that are VO, for example, and that V2, in the history of English, if it really had it, it got lost. And people have also suggested for more and more Romance languages that they were OV, like Latin at one point, and then they lost that and they also lost V2. So it may be that in contact situations, OV and V2 is quite likely to change. And then Afrikaans is in an interesting position because basically all the languages it's in contact with are SVO. So English, for sure. And then also a variety of different Bantu languages, they're all SVO, and different varieties of Arabic, they're all SVO as well. So if there is a contact problem with maintaining OV and V2, then Afrikaans surely should have become SVO, right? And the last thing, and I think very few people hopefully would now say that Afrikaans is a Creole, but there has been discussion. I mean, it is part of the APIX, it's one of the languages on the Atlas of Pidgins and Creoles, but it's been suggested that there are Creole-like properties in Afrikaans, and of course the OV-V2 properties you would not expect to see. So it is interesting that these properties OV and V2 have remained so stable. So what I didn't say is that Afrikaans, the Dutch, was 17th century Dutch, so it's a very long period of time for the OV and V2 to have remained as stable as it has. And it's very important that it is so stable. So even in the variety of Afrikaans that is most influenced by other languages, other SVO languages, notably English, the OV plus V to C pattern is completely stable. So this variety is Kaaps, and I've just given an example from a recent book, Spooky, in which you can see a little bit of the mixing. So moenie 'n groot lunch eetie. So don't eat a big lunch. You see very clearly this is an OV system. So that's very interesting. Yeah, just a bit of promotion. Since Kaaps is a very interesting variety of Afrikaans, it seems to be simultaneously the oldest and the most contact influenced. So there's a project underway on that at the University of the Western Cape. Right, but so that was the first. So the first reason that the negative imperatives and what they signal, why that might be interesting, I was suggesting, was that OV and that V movement have remained so stable in Afrikaans. A second reason that it's very interesting is this one. So let's consider again the difference between Afrikaans and Dutch, right? So in Afrikaans, the negative imperative requires you to use moenie, and in Dutch, you can just use the positive one and insert a niet, right? So now let's pay attention to the relative placement of that negation. So not the one at the end in Afrikaans, the first one, right? The nie and the Dutch niet and the position of the object, right? So as you should be able to see there now, because in Afrikaans you have to use moenie, the object always directly follows the nie. Whereas in Dutch, it's exactly the opposite, right? If you've got a definite object, it will precede that niet. So in imperatives, in negative imperatives, Afrikaans speakers get completely different input to Dutch speakers in terms of what the relative order of the negation marker, the nie, and an object should be, right? In Dutch, if that object is definite, the object will definitely be before the negator. In Afrikaans, it's very easy to remember moenie is at the start, so all objects are always going to occur after it. Why is that interesting? Now let's compare Afrikaans and Dutch. So in Dutch, you can say, hij heeft het boek niet gelezen, and that is the neutral structure. It just means he didn't read the book. And you can see the book precedes niet. That's what we saw in the imperative just now. And you do have the marked possibility of saying, hij heeft niet het boek gelezen, and that would be a contrast of things. So he didn't read the book, he might have read something else. Now let's look at Afrikaans. It's the exact opposite, right? So in Afrikaans, the default position, the unmarked one, would be to have nie and die boek. And you can have die boek preceding nie, but that is the marked interpretation that in Dutch you get with the opposite ordering, right? So what it looks like is in Afrikaans, the unmarked position for definite objects follows nie, which is the pattern that we see in negative imperatives, right? So you would say moenie die boek. So that's the unmarked position in Afrikaans. And this is very important because this is a change from the pattern that we find in standard West Germanic scrambling structures, right? And scrambling is just the phenomenon that objects can move. So if you look at 10a in Dutch, the fact that the object is not directly next to the verb, we say it's scrambled to the left. And the basic pattern in Dutch is always, and German too, is that if something is definite or specific, then it will scramble past niet to the left. And what we see in Afrikaans is that that basic pattern has been completely disrupted. The basic pattern in Afrikaans follows what we get in negative imperatives. And this puzzled me for years. I could never understand why Afrikaans was different, but it really does seem to be something that emerges as a result of the pattern in imperatives is just generalized. So we have a difference between Afrikaans and Dutch, and this one is just quickly to show that German behaves like Dutch. It's very clear that Afrikaans is the outlier here. Right, and then a further departure from Standard West Germanic, if you think about the use of the negative quantifier. So in German and in Dutch, you would say, if you want to say I have no ticket, you would say ich habe keine Fahrkarte, for example, in German. In Afrikaans, the sort of corresponding form should be geen, keine, no, should be geen. But actually in Afrikaans, the way to say I don't have a ticket is ek het nie 'n kaartjie nie. So really, what it looks like is that not the sentential negator and the indefinite article replaces this negative quantifier geen, right? So, or which would be kein in German. And again, if you think about why that should be, just think about the negative imperative. In a negative imperative, if you want to say don't buy a ticket in Afrikaans, you'll have to say moenie, as you always do. You need moenie. So if you're going to say don't buy a ticket, you say moenie 'n kaartjie koop nie. If you say moenie geen kaartjie koop nie, it means don't buy no ticket, buy a ticket, right? Which is not what you're trying to say. So there again, you have this evidence that you should be using nie and not geen. And if you contrast German, in German you just say kauf keine Fahrkarte. So there's no problem. You're not bound to use an initial negative containing form. And yeah, in Afrikaans you just can't use geen neutrally at all. So yeah, I won't go through this in great detail. It's just a nice example of recycling though. So it's not that we've lost geen completely, but now geen in Afrikaans has to be a strong form. So if I want to say you don't have to wear a tie, and it just means you don't have to wear one, the neutral meaning, I would say jy hoef nie 'n das te dra nie. Not a. So just like what you would see in a negative imperative. But if I say jy hoef geen das te dra nie, then you've just told me that I have to wear a tie, and I'm objecting and saying, now, contrary to what you seem to think, you don't have to wear a tie. So that's a kind of pragmaticalized use. And yeah, so that's recycling. Right, so if we have a quick summary of Afrikaans imperatives, because I want to get briefly onto Namibian and then very briefly onto South African English, and then we'll be done. The positive imperatives seem to be important because what they clearly do is reinforce, because we of course do see V to C movement in declaratives as well. So positive imperatives very, very clearly reinforce the V2 or the V to C property, which, as we were saying, seems to be contact sensitive. Negative imperatives also reinforce the V to C movement, but also the OV ordering, right? And because that's definitely something where people have suggested contact can result in a change. I didn't talk about what you can learn about extra position options, but that's also something else. It's not something I mentioned here, but the types of phrases that you're allowed to leak past the verb are also clearly signaled in negative imperatives. They signal negative concord. We did talk about that. And they also seem to establish the default position for objects in negative structures, okay? And that then affects the classic West Germanic scrambling pattern. And I didn't talk about this, but this shows you all these knock-on effects, these properties that emerge as a result of one thing being established, how there are knock-on effects. So in Afrikaans, one knock-on effect of the fact that the scrambling position has been messed up for definite objects, right? They're actually in the wrong kind of position. If you're not doing negation, it's still, you do scramble objects in the West Germanic way, but it's only after negation where all the objects are in the wrong place. So what has actually arisen in Afrikaans is a differential object marking pattern. Now, DOM, there's loads of work on Romance languages because many of them have this property, but Afrikaans is, to the best of my knowledge, the only Germanic language that has innovated a differential object marking pattern. And it's very clearly a response, an emergent property that arises from what has happened to the setup in the scrambling domain. Right, and then the negative imperative also reduces the context for geen, which then paves the way for the repurposing, so the recycling of this negative quantifier. And then what's of course interesting if you're just thinking about just what the consequence of all the innovations is, if you talk to a German or a Dutch speaker, they'll say, "Oh, Afrikaans sounds very emphatic as a result of all these extra things." So that's just interesting. Right. So now let's move on briefly to Namibian German. I am really nearly done, but as far as Namibian German is concerned, this is a language which you can see Namibia is a neighboring country in South Africa. Its population is much smaller, so South Africa is about nearly 60 million now, and Namibia is only 2.6 million. And the number of German speakers is tiny. There are only about 20 to 30,000 L1 German speakers in Namibia, or about 7% of the white population. And they all live in that sort of, if you look at the map on the right, they live in the areas which are also the biggest areas where Afrikaans is spoken. So that's the bottom, the 36.1 and the 41% one. So the major contact language for Namibian German is Afrikaans, which is actually spoken by 10% of Namibia's population, or 60% of the white population. English, which is the official language, is only spoken by 7% of the white population, and it's an absolute minority language in Namibia. Just to introduce my collaborators here, Juliane Bokmuhl is actually a speaker of Namibian German, and Sheena Shah was a former student of mine who's now finished her PhD and become an extraordinary language documenter, but she actually did her first bit of research on Namibian German, and we're still doing work on South African Germans. So what about NamDeutsch, right? So we've said Afrikaans is the major contact variety, with the German speakers are the minority group. And now let's just look at whether, if there are any interesting contact effects. So let's look at the Namibian German negative imperatives. Well, there are a range of options here, including the ones that you would have seen, something quite similar to what you would see in standard German. So fronting the verb, mach das nicht, for example, but also the infinitival option, or something a little bit like it, because the nicht das ordering is not, I think, what you would do in standard German. But the point is, there is a verb fronting and there's an infinitival option. And then, in addition, muss nicht spät sein, and also things like net nicht spät sein, where you can immediately see the Afrikaans influence. And here are just some examples which give you an idea of what a mixed language Namibian German is. It incorporates words from English, these are the ones which are italicized and underlined, and a little bit of Afrikaans as well. And the examples here are just meant to show you that this muss nicht is really quite common. You hear it an awful lot. And you can see again, in each case, muss nicht, and then you've got the object following. So it seems to have become the default among the default spoken language negative imperative. But then you might say, okay, so now we've got a muss nicht. What about these other effects that I said are connected, that emerge as a result of having a prohibitive like that? So that, for example, the negative should precede the object. So we did see some examples already in the imperatives I gave. So you've got muss nicht, and then the object follows. But then what was even more interesting was when we asked speakers to do some translation exercises, some of them gave us the correct German modal that you should use for musst. So they're talking about dürfen. So we shouldn't lose our sense of humor. Wir dürfen unseren Humor nicht verlieren. That's a very nice German sentence where you can see the object precedes nicht. That's what you should do in standard German. But they also produce things like this, where you have müssen instead of dürfen. Then you have nicht preceding the object. So we have two different types of examples like that. So where they replace dürfen with müssen, we see the ordering that we get from the imperative. And the second clause internal effect, there's a bit of evidence as well. So again, quite a lot of variation, but speakers were accepting structures like ich habe nicht ein Ticket gekriegt instead of ich habe kein Ticket. And some of that also has to do with the South African influence of the Afrikaans influence of using the got verb too often. Right, so what we then see is that both of the internal effects that we've said are kind of emergent in Afrikaans because of what you have in the imperative. You see that where you have overuse of müssen. So the Afrikaans negative imperative structure clearly has impacted significantly on Namibian German, right? And then the last one, this is super quick, is just to show that Afrikaans, we often say that in South Africa, Afrikaans people often complain about English affecting Afrikaans, but Afrikaans has certainly also affected the structure of South African English. So worldwide, it's been observed that the modal must is used less and less in English, and particularly, for example, in US varieties, where have to is used quite a lot. But in South African English, must is still very commonly heard. And in fact, must is a very moderate obligation modal. If we want to have a stronger one, we would actually use should. And what's very interesting is if you actually look at imperatives in South African English, you will have all the usual ones that you find in standard English, but then additionally also things like this. You must remember to buy a ticket, and you must not lose your passport. You mustn't lose your passport, and which seems fine. But then we also have things like you must sleep well, you must have a good holiday, and you must relax, which are sort of friendly exhortations. They're not strong obligations at all, but they're it's an expanded use of this toned down must, which you also see in Afrikaans. And then you see an introduction of a modal particle. So you must just. There are lots of must just examples. So we also see in South African English must over extension, which looks very much like it. The assumption has always been, because the tracking of when this became very prominent does seem to correlate with what you see in Afrikaans, that this is influenced from Afrikaans. So just to conclude, if we're thinking about the acquisitional significance of imperatives, the Southern African case studies really point to ways in which the structural cues from imperatives may be quite important in reinforcing early acquired properties, like, for example, OV and V2, which then, of course, means that we can understand why they might be stable in contexts where you might expect them to undergo change. So that's important. So they really seem to matter. And then in the Afrikaans imperative structure, what we actually see is the imperative structure has both a reinforcing role, so it helps to preserve the OV and V2, but it also drives change. So as a result of having the negative concord so strongly reinforced there, and having the muni, which triggers all kinds of changes, both types of things are happening. And then we see that there are also contact effects in Namibian German and South African English, which all seem to be connected to contact with the Afrikaans imperative. So crucially then, we see that what it looks like is as if the basic structure, which is signaled in imperatives, can actually play a foundational role in other domains, which is exactly what you sort of expect on a Maximise Minimal Means type approach, where you expect a foundational property to have knock-on effects and to lead to the emergence of other properties. Right, and that's it. So thank you, baie dankie, and muito obrigada.
Thank you, Theresa, for a very interesting talk. So we have some questions here. Ana Regina Calindro asks how the MMM approach how through the maximizing minimal means approach can we distinguish internal feature change from the changes triggered by contact?
I see. So firstly, hi, Anna. Very nice to have your question. Then in terms of actually distinguishing them, the question would be why we would want to distinguish them, because I'm not sure that's really what, I mean, the MMM model isn't really that interested in saying there's nothing in the model that says we need to distinguish features that are internal to a system from those which come from an external source. In fact, in a sort of generative model, I don't think it's not really very helpful in a contact scenario, I think, to think about features which are kind of native to a system, and then those which come from outside as being completely different. Because when features, the way features from contact with an external system are incorporated into a contact variety is to fit them in with the existing features in that contact variety. So often it'll superficially look like a structure has been borrowed, but that's just a metaphorical way of speaking. What's actually happened is that that system has incorporated the structure in a way that fits with the existing system. So I certainly don't think of MMM as a sort of, I'm not trying to use it as a heuristic to try to distinguish between native and contact or borrowed features. I don't know if I've understood the question correctly, but that would be the sort of
answer. So the Langis Darley asks, what is the role of lexicon in your approach? How does it work in comparison to the minimalist program?
Okay, thanks. Nice question. I think it sort of works in the same kind of way. So I also have the approach that we'll obviously have the lexicon. There will need to be sound meaning mappings, where you might say, you had a talk by Fivos the other day on roots. So I might think those would be roots which have phonological, they have sound, they're kind of sound meaning pairings, but maybe no formal features. And then there's a component of the lexicon, certainly, where there are functional categories which need to be specified with formal features. So those would be the ones that you would expect to be the locus of what you sometimes describe as parametric differences, or you don't need to use that terminology. But basically, if you think in terms of what the Borer-Chomsky conjecture would say, there will be a part of the lexicon which is just about pure semantic and phonological mappings. That would just be the kind of the root type elements without any formal features. And then you also have to allow for a component of the lexicon which basically has elements which are formally specified with features, which then which if you compare language A and language B, you can say, well, they systematically behave differently because the featural composition of these functional categories is different. So I don't think, I'm not consciously trying to say anything different about the nature of the lexicon.
Okay. I was actually thinking about, I have a similar question to this previous one. I was thinking about Vilchik's work about universal influence, in which she says that not all languages use tense for situation
Yeah.
situation the event, right? Actually, not the event, but the whole thing. So some languages use person features or location features,
Yeah.
and even aspect features, right? Showing that if you do not have T, you go below.
Go down, that's right.
So maybe there's some instruction from universal languages saying, oh, find the feature that best fits here to locate the whole utterance. And then it's particular from the language. So the UG would be very minimal in the sense that it would only give the instruction, and the child has to find the right feature, right?
That's right. The substantive content needs
Yeah.
to be filled in based on the input. Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, effectively, that I'm very much in favor of that way of looking at things. I mean, I think the interesting research question is, do we need a kind of basic skeletal structure? So if you think about Martina Wilczko's work, she does have a basic sort of, there are these core categories that have to be present, and then, as you were saying quite rightly, we need to then be exposed to input, and then you see, for example, whether the anchoring sort of component of the structure, are you going to use time or person or location, right? So I like that kind of view. The question is, can you go even more minimal? And I'm not saying you can, but could you go even more minimal and have those basic sort of requirements fall out from something else, so that you don't even need to have that in universal grammar? I don't know. But I mean, the spirit of what I'm saying, it may not have been very clear when I was talking about the English example with the polarity, right? But the spirit would be very much that you may find that that there might be a general feature, and then the specific contents needs to be separately fleshed out. That's very much the spirit of this kind of approach, because it allows you to maximize the feature. If it's basically an attribute, and you can use it by being more precise about the subtypes of feature, then you're linking up the first feature that you postulated, and that's very much the kind of feature structure that Maximise Minimal Means would prefer. So it fits beautifully with the Wilczko type work.
Okay, nice. Oh, so another question by Delangis Dalir again. So it's related to the acquisition of imperative. And he asks whether it's possible to consider that a feature related to force is developed at first in our mind.
Right, that is an excellent question, right? So I'm not sure is the answer, right? I mean, it seems to be not implausible. If you think, I mean, it depends what kind of force feature that is. But if you think how generativists usually talk about force, they do talk about a declarative as opposed to, say, an imperative or an interrogative. And certainly, you will find systems where it's very clear that, for example, an imperative or an interrogative has some very distinctive property, that's connected with the C, so with the force. Then it would make a lot of sense to say that some sort of force feature is an early feature, and then you've got different types of sub options. But in some languages, I'm not so sure that. I mean, I'm really not sure what to say about that, to be honest. Whether force is a sort of an early feature that then needs to be fleshed out in the way that we were saying, for example, with the anchoring head.
Mhm.
I'm not sure. It could be, but what I did want to suggest was, because when I mentioned the English example where I was talking about maybe there's an early connection to polarity with C, that's clearly a very English specific kind of thing. So if you compare, for example, English with German or Dutch or Afrikaans, in those languages, everything moves. In every single phrase, you've got verbs moving to C. So it doesn't specifically signal anything relating to polarity. So there would be no input to be telling the child, oh, postulate a polarity related feature. So I actually do think that English is a weird system. And of course, I'm not saying anything new in saying that. I think everybody says English is, it's unfortunate that we've spent so much generative time on English, because English is quite odd if you look at other languages. But English may actually, the initial feature, and that's quite important in the Maximise Minimal Means approach, the features that get postulated early, to some extent, they're going to be similar across languages, but they can also be quite different. And that's where I think maybe it could be quite significant what kind of interrogatives and imperatives you have, and how closely they fit in with the rest of the grammar. So how similar are they to declaratives, for example? So the answer would be, in Dutch or German, there's always move something to the specifier position and then the verb is next, right? And questions, WH questions, are the same as declaratives in that respect. But for English, it's not the case. There's something really standout about WH questions, and later on, if you learn a more elaborate variety of English, you'll see, yes, you can do that with negatives as well, and so on. So the input is different for an English child. But just to come back to your question about force, I think that's something, I mean, it's sort of an exciting task, not just to assume that for all languages it's just force. It's actually to ask, what is the evidence? If we look at the sentence types children are exposed to, what would the evidence be for the kind of feature they might want to be postulating first? And that's not an easy question, but I don't think it's impossible to formulate.
So another question now by Luke Bradley, and he asks whether your knock-on effects of Mooney, actually it's a declarative sentence. Your knock-on effects of Mooney do seem to require that the child can segment out me. Can we be so confident of that, even allow for the examples with intervening modals?
Yeah, great question. I mean, clearly there is my assumption is very much that the child can work out that Mooney is must not. And what I'm saying about what the child is gaining from Mooney, clearly I'm not suggesting that the kinds of things that the child is getting out of those negative imperatives, that is knowledge that is accessible, all of it, at a very early stage, because we know that's not true, right? So if we look at the acquisition of Dutch, we also know that even though Dutch doesn't have a Mooney or a Mooney type element, Dutch children do frequently have initial modal negation type combinations, which you can see there's a difference. The point at which they realize, oh my goodness, it's a modal plus a negation, that's a later stage of development, right? So at early stages of development, you may be absolutely correct that the child doesn't realize Mooney is must, mut, and ni, right? And at that point, the sorts of things that I say connect to Mooney as a marker, clearly that's not what the child is acquiring at that stage of acquisition. The child is at that point maybe just learning that when there's Mooney, that behaves in the same way. I mean, the verbs don't move, whereas there's evidence for verbs moving in other cases, right? So the child can make some hypotheses about what kind of thing Mooney is, but not all the details. The whole, and I couldn't do that on top of everything else in this talk, but the idea would be that something like Mooney, what the child works out about the featural specification of Mooney, is also something that develops incrementally. So first, it might just be a very straightforward positional distributional thing that is learned, that this thing has to be in the first position, and when this thing is in the sentence, the verb, which you know from other, the positive counterpart of the sentence, for example, or for any declarative, then the verb suddenly can't move. That's already a useful distributional observation. And then later on, you're absolutely right, that observation about Muni and the evidence from the intervening elements helping the child to figure out, oh, Muni, Mut, and Ni, that I would put into that becomes accessible later on. I don't know if that answers the question, but it is quite important. Yeah, I wasn't sort of saying, because of course at this point I have no nicely developed timeline when the various things that can be gathered from the positive and negative imperatives, exactly when the child is drawing on everything. But the idea is absolutely not that all of this comes at once. There has to be, it depends. So the idea is very much the way Maximise Minimal Means really thinks about the development of the grammar is just its incremental building. So you have very few features to start with, and then you try and use them as much as you can, and you have to add from time to time. And of course, as you successfully figure out what the regularities are and assign featural specifications to them, then more and more other things become clear. So all the things I highlighted that you can see, that's more sort of an overview of the kinds of things the child might gather from the imperatives. But the idea is not that all of that is just magically available simultaneously. Absolutely not. But great question.
So I was wondering about not actually data like imperatives, because as you said, imperatives are very frequent. So children can extract a lot of information about the language from them. But what about data that is poor? So the children don't see very often. So I was thinking like parasitic gaps. So what does a child will extract from these data that are actually quite adults have problems with this piece of data because they don't see it, right? It's not very common. So I imagine how children will deal with them.
Yeah, no, that is another excellent question. I mean, the way the system would work is it's still very much the spirit of the classic generative approach here, right? That these sort of, as you were saying, these phenomena, which are very rare, or I mean, the sorts of things we always talk about as generativists, that we don't just look at what is possible in a language, but also what are the things that if you ask a native speaker, they'll just go, no way. How did they know that? They never heard it. So those sort of things, I still have the same sort of view as the classic, which I think is why you want to pursue a generative approach, is you want what your knowledge, the things that you have direct evidence for, you want that to create a knowledge system which is such that the things that you don't have a lot of evidence for, that you might have no evidence for, actually follow from the things that you have a lot of evidence for. So if you just think of the classic, it's just the same logic as say the null subject parameter. If it had all worked the way Ricci originally said, you don't need to hear that trace and those non-that trace things in English, for example. It's just from what you hear, you construct a grammar, which if you draw on that knowledge, you will say, no, that's fine, or that's not fine, even though you don't hear it very much. Okay. So, yeah. So it's the same, really. I mean, this is another sort of set of data that I think is very important to us. It's if you think about, I mean, any sort of going beyond the input scenario is important, right? Where you just know the input will be, as you were saying, far too infrequent, or it might actually, depending on how you look at it, you could say, oh, well, it could mean this or it could mean that. It's just not clear. All of those cases, you really have to rely on what is in the system already so that it can be generalized to account for those properties. So that doesn't give you a specific analysis of parasitic gaps, but the logic would have to be something like that.
Okay, thank you. So I think we don't have any more questions. So thank you, Theresa, again for this very interesting talk. And I would like to highlight now the importance of joining Agrolink to strengthen our community and area for our viewers, especially during these times. And we also invite you all to continue watching these talks and to spread the word about them to your friends and coworkers. So, Theresa, if you have something more to add before we finish the transmission.
Yeah, no, just another huge thank you to you. I, unfortunately, because I've been so busy up till now, am way behind, but you should see the list of brilliant talks that I am keen to listen to. And also, I mean, my students and colleagues are not being helpful by telling me about other ones. So I think you've created a treasure trove for us worldwide. And yeah, I think that's, in a way, also maximizing minimal means, right? If our usual ways of doing things are removed, that's what you could do. No, congratulations. We'll certainly spread the word.
Okay, thank you.